Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Night shift nurses see things most people never do. Patients speaking to empty corners, elevators arriving with no one inside, and rooms that call for help long after the patient inside has passed. Some things in hospitals can't be explained, and some never leave. Back in the fall of 1999, during what she now recalled as one of the most psychologically disorienting periods of her early nursing career, she accepted a permanent overnight position at a long-term care facility situated just outside the outskirts of Mobile, Alabama. A decision she had made not because she had any particular affinity for the graveyard shift, but because the quiet, uninterrupted hours offered something she had craved in the chaos of her previous jobs. Stillness, routine, and the absence of bustling daytime noise. The building itself was a reconfigured medical annex, originally constructed in the 1960s as part of a regional hospital expansion, though over the years it had undergone only partial renovations, so that much of the interior still bore the austere, almost sterile bones of its original structure. Walls covered halfway up in scuffed, cream-colored tiles, narrow hallways that curved slightly to accommodate the additions made over decades, and floors whose surfaces had worn down from the weight of decades of wheelchairs, stretchers, and soft-soled shoes moving in and out of dim rooms without fanfare. She had been at the facility for just under 2 weeks when she was placed in the North Wing, a quieter section of the building that housed patients classified as comfort only or end of life, which was the clinical way of saying that no curative efforts remained, and the role of the staff was to keep them clean, comfortable, and, when possible, undisturbed. Among the rooms at the far end of that wing was room 12, a modest space tucked neatly into the corner where the hallway ended in a blank wall with an old fire extinguisher mounted crookedly on its bracket. Unlike the other rooms, which often bore signs of family involvement, handwritten cards taped to walls, framed photos, personal blankets, and other small efforts to preserve identity. Room 12 had none of these things. It was sparsely furnished, with a hospital-grade adjustable bed positioned beneath a cracked ceiling vent, a narrow dresser with laminate veneer peeling at the corners, a lone chair that looked as though no one had used it in years, and a window that looked out onto a grove of pine trees that stood in uneven rows behind the building. The patient who occupied that room at the time was an elderly woman named Evelyn Pennington, whose chart described her condition as terminal, with signs of progressive decline due to metastatic disease, and who, during the nurse's few brief interactions with her, had remained largely nonverbal, often asleep, her breathing shallow, and her eyes barely open, even when stimulated. Though there was little information about family or visitors, what stood out most to the nurse was not the woman's appearance or condition, but rather the persistent, unmistakable scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her with an almost unnatural intensity. Not the sterile scent of hospital-grade hygiene products, but the kind used in perfumes or essential oil diffusers. Something older, floral, and powdery, which lingered not just on the woman's skin or gown, but in the air around her, as if the room itself had absorbed it over time. The night Evelyn Pennington passed away, the nurse had begun her shift as she always did, methodically, with no sense that anything unusual would occur. And when she made her 1 a.m. rounds, She had paused just briefly outside room 12 before stepping inside and noticing almost immediately that the woman's chest no longer rose and fell with the labored rhythm it had held the previous day. The body was still warm, her expression unchanged, and there were no signs of struggle or distress. Death, when it came, had arrived quietly, without incident, the way it often did in places like this. The nurse had followed protocol with the calm efficiency expected of her, recording the time of death on the log sheet, making the necessary calls to the family and morgue transport team, and remaining with the body until the removal team arrived, all without allowing emotion to interfere with her professional detachment. By the time the transport team had finished their work and the room was cleared and prepped for cleaning, it was just after 2 a.m., and the nurse returned to the station down the hall, where she sat alone beneath a humming overhead light, writing her notes and mentally organizing the final tasks she had to complete before morning. It was at precisely 2:14 a.m., according to both the digital wall clock and her own mental timeline, that the phone on the nurse's desk rang with a suddenness that cut cleanly through the quiet, like the first strike of thunder before a storm, prompting her to reach instinctively for the receiver before glancing down at the glowing screen that showed the originating extension. It had come from room 12. She froze for only a second before lifting the phone to her ear, convinced it must have been an internal glitch or perhaps a misconfigured line that had not yet been deactivated. But what she heard on the other end was neither a voice nor silence. It was something in between, a faint sound like static but heavier, more textured, as if she were hearing the movement of air through a distant tunnel or the whisper of a detuned radio left playing somewhere far from reach. She said nothing, waited several seconds, then slowly placed the receiver back onto its base, her hand now slightly colder than it had been moments before. She walked the length of the north wing hallway with a strange tightness in her chest, unsure what she expected to find, but compelled to verify for herself that room 12 remained empty and undisturbed. When she reached the door and opened it slowly, the air that spilled out into the hall was immediately, inexplicably colder than the rest of the building. So much so that she noticed it against her skin like a sudden draft from an open window, even though the room had been sealed just an hour before. The bed, still stripped of linens, remained untouched, and no signs of intrusion or movement could be seen. But there, unmistakably, was the scent of lavender, far stronger now than it had been during the woman's life, dense and cloying in the air, so potent that it momentarily drowned out the ever-present hospital cleaner odor she had grown used to ignoring. She lingered only briefly before turning away, unwilling to let her imagination take root, and returned to her station without recording the incident or sharing it with the morning shift. On the following night, the sense of unease she carried into the facility was far greater. No longer a vague tension, but a specific dread attached to the memory of the phone call and the smell that had permeated an otherwise empty space. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a stuck relay, perhaps leftover fragrance from the bedding. But no explanation sat well in her mind. The shift passed uneventfully until the hour drew near again. And just as the clock ticked past 2:14 a.m., the phone rang for a second time, and when she looked down at the screen, the same extension glowed softly, room 12. This time, when she picked up, there was no crackle of static. Instead, she heard a low hum, almost like a mechanical vibration coming from somewhere deep within the wiring, followed by a brief sequence of soft, rhythmic clicking sounds. 3 in quick succession, then a pause, then 2 more. She remained on the line, listening for further signals or sounds, but nothing followed, and the line went dead after 10 seconds of silence. She did not go down the hallway that night. She remained seated at her post, her back stiff and her hands folded tightly on her lap, staring at the darkened end of the corridor without moving until morning. Maintenance was notified, and the facility's phone technicians ran a series of tests on the building's internal system. They found no evidence of calls being placed from that extension, no signal traces, and no indication that the line had been live at all. The wiring, they insisted, had already been physically disconnected earlier that day. But the following night, despite all assurances, the call came again, right on time. And when she picked up the receiver, her fingers trembling slightly now, what she heard was unlike anything from the 2 nights before. It was a single, drawn-out inhalation. Not like someone breathing into the phone in the way prank callers or misdialed patients might. More like the phone itself was breathing, as if the sound was being produced by something using the line, not to speak, but to exhale, low and steady and wrong. After hanging up, she walked toward the room for what she hoped would be the final time, each step heavier than the last, the hallway elongating with each passing second, as if the distance were somehow stretching beneath her feet. When she reached room 12, she noticed immediately that the door, which had been closed since her last visit, was now slightly ajar. And the moment she stepped inside, the temperature change hit her like a wave. A sharp drop so severe that her breath became visible in the dim light spilling in from the hallway behind her. The lavender scent was overwhelming now. No longer subtle or nostalgic, but smothering, so strong it burned slightly at the edges of her nostrils. And as she looked toward the nightstand, she saw the phone, the same model that had been unplugged, disconnected, and marked for removal, vibrating in place with a faint, steady buzz. There were no lights on the device, no cords running to the wall, no connection to any power source. And yet it moved, softly but insistently, as if receiving a call from a place that had no origin in wires or signal. She turned and left without touching it. By morning, the room was locked indefinitely, the phone removed, the line sealed, and a quiet directive issued that no further patients were to be placed in room 12. Though no official documentation exists that explains what occurred, staff members continued to speak in hushed tones about the recurring scent, the cold that returned in waves, and the soft, phantom ringing that some claimed to hear during the deepest part of the night. She never worked another shift in that wing. And though years passed and the memories dulled slightly, she never quite shook the feeling that something in that room had reached through. Something that did not obey the natural order of time or death. Something that knew her name, even though it never said it. I had spent most of my adult life working night shifts in long-term care, and by the time 2016 arrived, I had already grown accustomed to the rhythm of late hours and fluorescent lights, to the stillness that crept into the corridors after visiting hours ended and families went home, and to the unspoken understanding that many of the people I cared for were slowly winding down their final chapters in the quiet rooms surrounding me. The facility, located on the outskirts of Bangor, Maine, wasn't particularly large or modern, but it was steady, reliable in the way that institutions like that can be, with the comforting repetition of scheduled medications, hallway checks, and the low murmur of televisions left on overnight for residents who couldn't sleep. Room 12B had always been one of the more unremarkable rooms at the end of the east hallway, positioned just beside a supply closet and across from the staff bathrooms. And for as long as I had been there, it had never drawn attention to itself. However, that changed after a series of losses during a cold February when both of its residents, women in their late 80s, passed away within weeks of one another. First one to pneumonia after a sudden turn in her condition, and then the other to what the chart noted simply as natural causes, which, in a place like that, was often the quiet culmination of years of decline. Following their passing, room 12B had been scrubbed and sanitized, the bed stripped and reset, and the door had been left ajar in that familiar limbo between occupancy and reassignment. Although for reasons never quite explained, new patients were never assigned to it during the weeks that followed. It was around that time, perhaps late March or early April, when I encountered the first indication that something was wrong, or rather something was simply not right, which is often how these kinds of experiences begin. Not with an obvious horror or loud disruption, but with a subtle shift in the atmosphere that gradually tightens its grip on you. It was sometime after midnight on an otherwise uneventful shift, the kind where the air feels heavy with routine and your attention dulls under the fluorescent glow of the nurse's station monitors. When I first noticed the soft red light for room 12B blinking steadily on the call board above the desk, I remember pausing mid-sentence in my chart notes, blinking back at it with a mixture of confusion and caution, because I knew that room had been empty for several weeks, and as far as I could recall, no staff member had been assigned to clean or prepare it during that shift. Still, I stood up, radioed a quick update to the floor's CNA, and began walking down the east corridor, which had always felt slightly colder than the rest of the building, a subtle difference I had long attributed to the aging HVAC system, but which that night seemed to carry a deeper chill that crept into the back of my neck as I approached the door to 12B. I opened it slowly, half expecting to find a fellow nurse rearranging linens or checking equipment, but the room was entirely empty. Both beds neatly made, the small dresser drawers closed, and the curtain drawn halfway between the beds, as it usually was after housekeeping completed their rounds. What caught me off guard, however, was the unmistakable sound that drifted across the room as I stood just inside the doorway. A faint and rhythmic sobbing, so soft and delicate that for a moment I wondered if it might be leaking in from another room through the ventilation system. But the more I listened, the more I realized that the crying wasn't distant at all. It seemed to be coming from within the room itself, from the space near the far wall where the oxygen hookups and call panel were mounted above the bed. The crying wasn't the loud, dramatic weeping of distress, but something far more fragile and heartbreaking, like the quiet, breathless whimper of a child trying not to be heard. The kind of crying that feels tucked beneath blankets and hidden behind small hands. I remained in the doorway longer than I probably should have, rooted by something I couldn't quite explain. Part fear, part disbelief, and part instinctive sorrow. Eventually, the sound faded into nothing, and the red call light on the wall blinked once more before going dark. I reset the panel manually, glanced over the room one more time to confirm no one was there, and then returned to the nurse's station, shaken but trying to convince myself that it had been an acoustic anomaly, a loose circuit triggering the light, or simply the side effects of working too many overnight shifts without enough sleep. Unfortunately, that explanation quickly lost its credibility when, less than 15 minutes later, the call light for room 12B activated again. I returned once more, walked the same path, opened the same door, and found the same empty room. Only this time, The crying began almost immediately as I stepped over the threshold, as if my presence had awakened something that had been waiting in the silence. This time, I didn't linger. I reset the panel quickly and walked back, trying not to let my anxiety show on my face as I passed the medication carts and glanced down the otherwise empty hallway. And then it happened again, and again. Over the course of that night, the call light in room 12B triggered a total of 6 times, and each time I entered, I was greeted by the same pattern, the same quiet, isolated crying, always coming from the same corner, always ending just moments after I stepped into the room. It wasn't until the following evening that I gathered the nerve to mention the incident to Evelyn, one of the most experienced nurses on staff. A woman whose calm demeanor had seen us through power outages, code blues, and more than one family shouting match in the hallway. As I described what had happened, her expression shifted gradually from polite interest to something far more serious. And when I mentioned the crying, she lowered her eyes and seemed to grow visibly pale, as if she'd been expecting to hear that part but had hoped she wouldn't. She then shared something I'd never been told, something not written down in any of the patient records or orientation briefings. Several years before I'd been hired, she explained, the facility had temporarily admitted a 6-year-old girl who had been placed under palliative care after being diagnosed with a late-stage degenerative disease. Pediatric admissions were extremely rare, but in her case, the parents had exhausted all options and could no longer manage the complexity of her care at home. The girl had stayed with us for less than 2 weeks before passing away quietly in her sleep, without incident, without pain, right there in the same bed beneath the window in room 12B. After the girl's death, there had been strange reports, incidents whispered among staff members but never formally documented. Toys placed in the pediatric supply room had been found moved between shifts, sometimes positioned unnaturally or found in places they didn't belong. A nurse reported finding a small plush animal, one that had been stored on a top shelf, resting perfectly upright in the middle of the hallway one morning. Another aide spoke of hearing soft tapping from inside the linen room near the east wing, the kind of quiet knocking that came in threes and stopped the moment someone entered. What disturbed me the most, however, was Evelyn's account of the footprints. More than once, during the early hours of the morning, small wet footprints had appeared on the tile floor of the back hallway supply room, leading from the corner near the mop sink to the hallway outside room 12B. The prints were always child-sized, always bare, and always vanished without leading anywhere else, as though whatever left them had simply disappeared. As more staff came forward with similar stories over the following months, the administration finally made the decision to shut down room 12B permanently. The beds were dismantled and removed, the equipment taken offline, and the call panel itself was disconnected from the master board, with the room officially designated as auxiliary storage space. For a time, the building grew quiet again, and many of us thought that whatever strange presence had lingered there had finally faded with time. But then, without warning, the light returned. Even after the circuit had been severed and the panel fully decommissioned, the call light for room 12B would still occasionally flicker to life on the nurse's station board, usually just once or twice a month, always between 2:45 and 3:15 in the morning. No sound accompanied it most nights, just that familiar red blink on a room that no longer existed on the patient roster. But on a few of those nights, when the building was especially quiet and the air felt too still, I could swear I heard the crying again, faint and broken, just beneath the sound of the heating vents and the distant hum of a portable oxygen tank rolling down the hallway. No one responds to that call light anymore. No one walks down the east wing to check it. We let it blink for a few minutes, and then, just as mysteriously as it comes on, it fades and disappears. Some of the newer nurses laugh it off as a faulty panel or a wiring issue no one has bothered to fix. But those of us who remember the girl, we don't laugh. We don't speak of it directly, and we certainly don't open that door. I don't believe in ghost stories the way they're told in books or movies. But I've always believed that certain emotions, particularly grief, can leave something behind. Something that doesn't fade with time or cleaning or paperwork. That room wasn't meant for a child. It wasn't built to carry a memory like hers. But it does. And even now, long after she's gone, it still remembers. And maybe, just maybe, she remembers us too. I spent nearly 3 decades working night shifts in hospitals, most of those years at the same small, slightly outdated facility tucked into a quiet patch of woodland in upstate New York. The building itself never changed much. 3 floors, a modest ER, a few dozen patient rooms, and hallways that always seemed a little too dim no matter how often maintenance replaced the bulbs. By the time 2011 came around, I had become one of the most senior nurses on staff, and people had started to treat me like part of the furniture. Always there, always calm, always watching the monitors even when no one else was paying attention. I was never someone given to superstition or exaggeration. I had seen people die quietly, and I had seen them die violently. And I had long ago learned the difference between what could be explained and what was just fatigue playing tricks on your senses. Or at least, I had thought I had. It was a Sunday night in early February, cold enough outside that the windows in the east wing had started to ice over. And the heating system, though reliable, groaned a little louder than usual as it worked to keep the building warm. That particular night had been uneventful by all accounts. There were no new admissions, no major emergencies, and most of the telemetry floor, where patients were monitored for cardiac issues, had gone quiet by midnight. By the time I looked up at the wall-mounted telemetry board near the nurses' station at around 3:10 a.m., I had already checked my last set of vitals and was preparing to enter the night's logs into the system. But then something on the screen caught my attention. Room 109, which had been unoccupied since the prior Friday, was displaying a full and completely active set of vitals. At first, I didn't react. It wasn't unheard of for old equipment to flicker or glitch, especially if someone had accidentally left a lead connected or if the telemetry port hadn't been properly reset after a discharge. But the monitor wasn't frozen or looping. It was updating in real time, showing a clean sinus rhythm, normal oxygen saturation, a steady respiratory rate, and a pulse that would have suggested someone was resting peacefully under observation. The problem was that room 109 had been closed since Mr. Halverson's passing. He had been a quiet, compliant patient in his 70s, brought in during his final decline due to complications from congestive heart failure. I remembered the man clearly. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. Always tried to sit up even when he barely had the strength to. And never complained about the discomfort he was obviously in. His death had been expected, peaceful and uneventful. I had covered his body myself, closed the room afterward, and made sure no one had disturbed it while we waited for maintenance and sanitization. So when I saw that clean, active waveform coming from a room I knew to be empty, I felt a subtle unease begin to stir. quiet at first, just enough to tighten the back of my neck. Still, I reminded myself that machines failed all the time, and I had dealt with enough false alarms over the years to know better than to immediately jump to conclusions. With the portable vitals tablet in hand and my sweater pulled tight around me, since that floor always ran just a few degrees too cold, I made my way down the main corridor toward room 109. The hallway was bathed in that pale fluorescent light that never fully reached the corners of the ceiling, casting long, soft-edged shadows along the floor. My footsteps were the only sound aside from the low mechanical hum that seemed to radiate from the walls whenever the heating system kicked in. As I passed the closed doors of the other rooms, most of them unoccupied, I felt something change in the air around me. The temperature dipped with surprising sharpness, and by the time I reached the far end of the corridor where room 109 sat, it felt as though I'd walked into a completely different part of the building. The chill wasn't simply atmospheric. It felt internal, like the cold was radiating outward from behind the door. I stood for a moment with my hand near the handle, trying to decide if I should call it in as a maintenance issue or simply verify it myself, when I became aware of something that made me stop cold. Through the thick door, I could hear what sounded like voices, low, hushed, and overlapping in a way that made them impossible to separate. They weren't coming from any television or device, and they didn't carry the sharp digital edge of a monitor malfunction. Instead, the sound reminded me of the kind of whispering you might hear in a church pew. Not conversational, but soft and constant, as though someone were murmuring to themselves or reciting something quietly just beneath their breath. As soon as I opened the door, the whispering ceased. The room inside was dark, lit only by the muted green glow of the monitor's display above the bed, which continued to show a healthy heart rhythm, complete with all vital statistics, as though someone were currently hooked to it. But what drew my eyes immediately wasn't the screen. It was the bed. The linens, which I had seen just days earlier laid flat and undisturbed, now bore the clear imprint of a body. The sheet had been pushed inward from the pressure of weight, the shape stretching the length of the mattress, with a pronounced dip where the torso and legs would have rested. The pillow had been indented at the center, the fibers creased and drawn down by the unmistakable pressure of a human head. No one was in the bed. No one was in the room. The cold was even more intense inside than it had been in the hallway. The air felt still, not merely unheated, but stripped of warmth, as though whatever force had passed through had taken all the ambient energy with it. I approached the monitor cautiously, resisting the instinct to look over my shoulder, and reached up to reset the telemetry system manually. The screen blinked, hesitated for a moment as the data froze mid-cycle, and then dropped to a flat line before clearing itself. The room fell into complete silence. I left without touching anything else, closing the door behind me and walking back to the station with the steady, deliberate pace of someone who has decided firmly not to react until absolutely necessary. I didn't log the incident beyond noting that a faulty monitor had been reset. I didn't speak to anyone about the strange sound I had heard or the impression left in the bed. These were details I filed away quietly, intending to make sense of them later, when I wasn't so tired and the lighting didn't feel quite so dim. About an hour later, sometime after 5 a.m., a younger nurse named Cora came up from the administrative wing carrying a flash drive and looking unusually focused. She had been assigned to pull security footage from earlier that weekend for a routine slip and fall review, and was working her way through the corridor recordings when she stopped and called me over. She didn't say much, just pointed at the screen and scrubbed to a timestamp that read 2:58 a.m. The camera angle captured the hallway directly outside room 109. At first, there was nothing. Just the quiet stretch of corridor illuminated by low hallway lights, empty and undisturbed. Then, with no warning, a figure came into frame. It was a man, walking slowly and unevenly down the hall, dressed in a faded hospital gown that hung loosely around his frame. His posture was familiar, slightly hunched, left arm hanging lower than the right, and one foot dragging behind the other in a slow, shuffling limp that I had seen many times before. He didn't look around, didn't pause, and made no sign of acknowledgement toward the camera. He simply walked, unhurried and deliberate, straight to the door of room 109. Without stopping, he opened it and stepped inside. That was all. No one else entered or exited that room for the remainder of the footage. I appeared several minutes later, walking with the tablet in hand, opening the same door and emerging alone. But the man who had entered moments before, he was never seen leaving. One of the newer nurses, who had joined us at the station by then, leaned in and stared closely at the figure on the screen. She didn't speak for a long time, and when she finally did, her voice was quiet, almost cautious. She said it looked exactly like Mr. Halverson, and it did, not just in posture or size, but in the way he carried himself. The slight twist of his neck when he walked, the dragging of his left leg, the shape of his shoulders beneath the gown. It was him. There was no doubt about it, and no one in that room even tried to argue otherwise. Cora saved the footage to her folder and created a backup, noting the exact timestamp and sequence ID to ensure it could be accessed later. We all assumed we would bring it up at the morning meeting, maybe even submit a formal review to administration. But by the time the day staff attempted to open the file later that morning, it was gone. Not erased, not misfiled, corrupted. The archive showed no record of that segment ever existing. Even the saved copy on Cora's flash drive had disappeared, wiped clean of any trace. No formal report was ever filed. No one wanted to be the first to bring it up officially, to suggest that something had happened that didn't fit into any of our clinical protocols or technical explanations. Room 109 was cleaned, reassigned, and equipped with a new telemetry unit before the end of the week. Life on the third floor resumed its usual rhythm. But I submitted my retirement paperwork before the month ended. It wasn't fear that prompted my decision. It was something quieter, something more difficult to name. A feeling that the walls I'd always trusted to be solid had shifted slightly, and that the line between the living and the dead might not be as absolute as I had once believed. For months after, I continued to hear stories in passing, small things. A blip on the telemetry board showing activity in a room that was empty. A cold spot reported during cleaning, but nothing like that night. Every now and then, even years later, I would think back to that single moment on the telemetry board. The calm, steady rhythm from room 109, flashing on the screen like any other patient under my care. I had worked the night shift at the downtown Phoenix hospital for long enough that the silence no longer unsettled me. And over time, I'd come to appreciate the peculiar stillness that settled in after midnight, when the flurry of emergency calls slowed to a trickle, and the hallways seemed to exhale in a rare moment of peace, leaving behind only the mechanical rhythm of ventilators and the distant, steady pulse of cardiac monitors. The building itself was old, built in the late 1970s. and though it had undergone several renovations over the years, certain corners of the hospital still clung to a kind of worn, sterile gloom, especially after hours, when the foot traffic died down and fluorescent lights buzzed softly over vacant waiting rooms and idle corridors. That particular night in 2006 had started out uneventfully, and though the earlier part of the shift had involved a few time-sensitive traumas and the usual battery of consults and vitals, by the time it reached 2 a.m., the energy had dipped into that strange, liminal quiet that always made the building feel larger than it really was. I had just finished logging patient notes and updating charts at the station. And after checking the inventory list, I realized I needed to bring a tray of prepped IV kits and respiratory equipment from the central supply room on the lower level up to the ICU on the 4th floor. Normally, I would have used the main elevator, which was larger and more reliable. But both lifts had been redirected for patient transport due to a cardiac arrest coming in from the ER, and I didn't want to wait. The only other option was the old service elevator tucked at the end of the west hallway, a narrow, dimly lit corridor that passed behind radiology and ended in a utility junction where the tile floors turned yellow with age and the walls bore the stains of forgotten leaks and haphazard maintenance. The service lift wasn't broken, but it had earned a reputation among staff as the least trustworthy of the elevators in the hospital, mostly due to its outdated wiring and sluggish door mechanisms that often took longer than they should to respond. And while most of us used it sparingly, it was still functional enough to rely on in a pinch. Balancing the supply tray against my hip with both hands, I pressed the call button, which blinked sluggishly before the elevator arrived with a familiar metallic groan, the kind that always sounded like something scraping against itself from a place deep in the shaft where light never reached. When the doors finally opened with their usual stuttering delay, I stepped inside the narrow car and turned to press the button for the 4th floor, expecting the elevator to lurch upward in its typical slow, rumbling fashion. But almost immediately after the doors closed, I felt the floor shift beneath me in the opposite direction. And instead of ascending, the car began to descend. Not sharply, not with a jolt, but with a steady, silent drop that felt deliberate and uninterrupted by the mechanical hesitation I had grown used to. I looked up at the small digital display above the control panel, expecting to see the number B1 appear as we passed the basement. But the screen showed nothing at all. Just a faint red glow with no visible digits, as though the system had powered on without direction or awareness of where it was headed. I pressed the button for the 4th floor again, and when nothing changed, I tried tapping the door open button out of instinct, but the car continued to descend without resistance, the silence around me pressing in like a heavy cloth, muting the already distant hum of the hospital above. By the time the elevator came to a stop, the atmosphere inside the car had shifted completely. The air felt colder, unnaturally so, and the lights overhead flickered with a stuttering pattern that sent jittery shadows bouncing off the metal walls, as if the circuitry had begun to fail under strain. When the doors opened, what lay beyond them was not a hallway or a storage room or any section of the hospital I had ever seen. Instead, I was confronted with complete and impenetrable darkness, the kind of thick blackness that didn't seem to begin anywhere or end anywhere, and gave no indication of depth or shape or orientation. I remained standing just inside the elevator, unwilling to move even an inch forward, because every part of me instinctively understood that whatever existed beyond that doorway was not part of the hospital I had come to know over years of navigating its floors. The cold that entered the elevator wasn't the kind of drafty chill you sometimes feel when standing near old ducts or in the lower levels near maintenance. It was much deeper, a bone-hollowing cold that felt as though it had been sealed away underground for decades and had only now been allowed to spill outward into the space I occupied. I pressed the door close button again and again, hoping to trigger the mechanism, but nothing happened. Then, I pressed the emergency call switch, and after a brief static burst, I was met not with the expected voice of security or the operator, but with a low, wet, hissing static that was faintly overlaid with the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, heavy, and uneven, like someone standing close enough that I should have been able to see them, but who remained completely hidden within that shapeless void. That was when I heard the footsteps. They were not hurried or rhythmic or sharp like the sound of shoes on tile, but soft, wet-sounding, and deliberate. Bare feet making contact with hard concrete, dragging slightly with each step, as though the person approaching carried an old injury or simply didn't have the strength to lift their feet properly. The sound grew steadily louder, though it never increased in speed. And I remained frozen in place, clutching the supply tray to my chest, with my back pressed against the elevator wall as I listened to something I could not see draw nearer with each labored step. I didn't cry out. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was locked in place by a cold that had settled not just into the air, but into my skin, my muscles, and even my breath, which I held instinctively as if to avoid being heard. And just as the sound reached what I felt must have been the edge of the threshold, where whatever was out there would soon step into view, the elevator doors slammed shut with a speed and force I'd never experienced from that car before, as though it had been pulled shut by something external, not by its own mechanics. The elevator then began to rise rapidly, the digital display returning to life one floor at a time, passing it through levels I recognized. B1, ground, second, third, and finally arriving at the fourth floor, where the doors opened smoothly, revealing the familiar corridor that led to the ICU, brightly lit and clinically sterile, as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. I stepped out without speaking, without looking back, and walked straight to the supply room, placing the tray down with trembling hands and trying to calm my breathing before anyone could ask me where I had been. Later that morning, once my shift had ended and I returned home, I attempted to make sense of what had happened, convincing myself it must have been some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion, or perhaps an electrical failure that triggered a sensory misfire in the brain. But when I filed a basic report to the hospital's facilities department, I kept my description limited to the practical: that the elevator had descended unexpectedly to an unmarked level, that the doors had opened to a space with no lighting, and that the emergency intercom had returned nothing but static. A few days later, I received a written reply from maintenance, stating that no irregularities had been found in the elevator's operation during that shift, that the car had registered movement from the supply floor directly to the fourth floor with no deviation, and that there had been no record of the emergency button being pressed at any point during the time in question. Their explanation was polite but firm, suggesting perhaps a temporary data glitch or a sensor malfunction that did not reflect a mechanical issue requiring repair. Still, I couldn't let go of what I had experienced, and some part of me needed to know whether anyone else had ever seen or heard what I had. It was during a late-night break a few weeks later, while sitting in the staff lounge with a few others, that I found the opportunity to bring it up in a quiet, careful way. Not directly, not with dramatic emphasis, but simply asking if the service elevator had ever behaved strangely during overnight shifts. That was when one of the older orderlies, Grant, who had been with the hospital since the early 1980s, paused mid-conversation and said, with a kind of distant tiredness in his voice, that during the original construction of the hospital in the late 1970s, a young electrician had fallen into an unsealed shaft while working overnight, and that although a search was conducted, the body had never been recovered. He explained that the shaft had been sealed shortly after, the wiring rerouted, and the incident quietly removed from any formal documentation. But among the older staff, there had always been rumors, stories of phantom floor indicators lighting up without reason, emergency calls returning only silence, and elevator doors opening onto floors that weren't part of the building's schematics. He didn't elaborate further, and I didn't ask. From that night onward, I refused to step foot into that elevator again, regardless of the circumstance. I used the stairs, no matter how tired I was or how many levels I had to climb, because I understood that what I had experienced had not been a dream or a mechanical malfunction. Something had been down there, something that didn't belong within the walls of a hospital or anywhere above ground. And even now, long after I've left that job behind, I still carry the memory of the cold pressing in through those open doors, and the slow, dragging footsteps approaching from the dark, where no light has ever reached.